The gymnasium smelled like stale popcorn and decades-old varnish. Red, white, and blue streamers hung limply from basketball hoops, and folding tables groaned under the weight of casserole dishes and store-bought pies. The Riverside High School class of '89 30-year reunion was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully orchestrated display of who had made it and who hadn't. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stood near the entrance, adjusting the sleeves of my simple navy blazer, watching familiar faces that had grown rounder, grayer, more weathered by time. The same cliques had reformed as if no time had passed at all. The popular kids clustered around the punch bowl, still radiating that effortless confidence. The athletes gathered near the trophy case, their championship rings catching the fluorescent light. And then there was my family. They occupied the center table like royalty holding court. My older brother Marcus sat at the head, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, gold watch glinting as he gestured broadly while telling some story that had the others hanging on every word. He'd built a successful real estate empire, owned half the commercial properties downtown, and never let anyone forget it. My sister Caroline lounged beside him in designer everything: dress, shoes, handbag that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her medical practice had made her the family's golden child, the one who'd made something of herself by following the path they'd all approved of. My younger brother Thomas rounded out their triumvirate, still riding the wave of his high school football glory despite being 47 years old. His car dealership had done well enough to afford the lifestyle that kept him in their good graces: the boat, the vacation home, the country club membership. And there I was, David Mitchell, the family disappointment, the one they whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear, the one who'd thrown his life away on impossible dreams, the one who'd embarrassed them at every family gathering with his stubborn refusal to settle down, get a real job, stop chasing fantasies. I watched my mother, Patricia Mitchell, lean close to Mrs. Henderson from down the street. Even from across the room I could read her lips well enough to know she was explaining my absence from family photos, my lack of a wedding ring, my perpetual status as the son who never quite measured up. David always was different, she'd say with that practiced sigh. We tried to guide him, but some people just won't listen to reason. The reunion had been going on for 2 hours, and I'd managed to avoid them entirely. I'd spoken with old teachers, chatted with classmates who remembered me fondly, even danced with Sarah Chen, who'd been my lab partner in chemistry. But my family remained a careful distance away, a gravitational force I neither wanted to approach nor could fully escape. It was Marcus who spotted me first, his eyes narrowed across the crowded room, that familiar look of disdain settling across his features. He said something to Caroline, who turned to look, her mouth curving into that cold smile I remembered from childhood. Thomas followed their gaze, shaking his head with obvious disapproval. The whisper started immediately. "Is that David? What's he doing here? Someone should tell him this is for successful people." I'd heard variations of these comments my entire life. At family dinners where they discussed their achievements while I sat in silence. At Christmas gatherings where they compared salaries and vacation destinations while I deflected questions about my career. At weddings and funerals where relatives would ask what I was doing with my life, and my family would answer with embarrassed shrugs. The truth was, I'd built something extraordinary. Something that had consumed 20 years of my life, every waking moment, every ounce of energy and passion I possessed, but they'd never understood it. They'd never even tried. I remembered the exact moment I'd stopped trying to explain. It was Thanksgiving. I'd been invited to speak at the Kennedy Center, an honor that had left me speechless when the call came. I'd rushed home to share the news, bursting through the front door of my childhood home with my heart pounding with excitement. "They want me in Washington," I'd announced to the assembled family. The Kennedy Center. Can you believe it? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had looked up from his phone with barely concealed irritation. "David, when are you going to stop with this nonsense and get a real job?" Caroline had sighed, not even bothering to look up from her medical journal. "You're 46 years old. This is getting embarrassing." My mother had patted my hand with that condescending gentleness she'd perfected over the years. "Sweetheart, We all had dreams when we were young, but there comes a time when you have to face reality. I'd tried to explain the significance, the doors it would open, the validation from people whose opinions mattered in my field, but they'd exchanged those looks, the ones that said he's delusional again, and slowly, deliberately, changed the subject to Thomas's latest car sales numbers. That night, I'd sat alone in my childhood bedroom, staring at the acceptance letter in my hands, and something inside me had shifted. I'd stopped trying to make them understand. I'd stopped coming to family gatherings. I'd stopped calling with updates about my life. I'd built my world without them. And now, standing in this gymnasium surrounded by the ghosts of our shared past, I could feel their judgment like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. They were whispering to other reunion attendees, no doubt sharing their version of my story. The son who'd never amounted to anything, the brother who'd wasted his potential, the family member they had to apologize for. But what they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to learn, was that everything was about to change. Because tomorrow morning, I would stand before the nation and take an oath that would redefine not just my life, but theirs. Tomorrow, the entire world would know who David Mitchell really was. Tonight, though, I was still just the disappointment in the corner, watching my family hold court and pretend I didn't exist. I checked my watch. The advance team had confirmed everything was in place. The security perimeter had been established. The contingency plans were locked and loaded. In exactly 17 minutes, 6 men and women would walk through those gymnasium doors and change everything forever. My family had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant understanding your place in the hierarchy from the moment you could walk. Marcus was the crown prince, 7 years older than me, destined for greatness according to everyone who mattered. Caroline followed 3 years later, the brilliant daughter who would carry the family name into respectability. Thomas came along when I was 4, and even as a baby he commanded more attention than I ever did. I was the middle child who disrupted the perfect symmetry they'd created. Our house on Elm Street was a monument to their achievement. The mantelpiece displayed Marcus's Little League trophies, Caroline's spelling bee ribbons, Thomas's participation certificate, my own accomplishments, a short story published in the school literary magazine, a debate tournament victory, a science fair honorable mention, never quite made it to the display. We don't want to clutter the space, my mother would say, carefully arranging Caroline's honor roll certificate. Besides, these things are just hobbies, aren't they, David? Dinner conversations followed a predictable pattern. Marcus would detail his business plans, even at age 12, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd already conquered the world. Caroline would discuss her latest medical journals. She'd decided to become a doctor at age 8, and never wavered. Thomas, despite being the youngest, somehow always had sports achievements to share. I learned to eat quickly and quietly. The family photos told the story more clearly than words ever could. Professional portraits lined the hallway, chronicling our growth through the years. In every single one, I stood slightly apart from the others, as if the photographer had struggled to find a place for me in their perfect composition. Marcus stood tall and proud behind my father's right shoulder. Caroline perched elegantly beside my mother. Thomas, small but beaming, occupied the center spot, and there I was, off to the side, looking like a visitor who'd accidentally wandered into someone else's family portrait. School became my refuge, the one place where being different wasn't a liability. I discovered I had a gift for understanding people, for seeing the connections between ideas that others missed, for finding solutions to problems that seemed impossible. My teachers noticed. Mrs. Davidson, my 8th grade civics teacher, pulled me aside after class one October afternoon. "David, you have something special," she said, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from recognizing potential. "The way you think about governance, about bringing people together. Have you ever considered politics?" I laughed. The idea seemed absurd. Politicians were serious people with serious backgrounds, people like my siblings who commanded rooms and inspired confidence. They weren't awkward middle children who preferred books to basketball. But Mrs. Davidson persisted. She encouraged me to join the debate team, to run for student council, to write for the school newspaper. Slowly, I began to discover that the very qualities that made me an outsider at home, my ability to listen, to understand different perspectives, to find common ground, were exactly what made me effective in these arenas. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I won my first election at 14, becoming freshman class president by a landslide. I rushed home with the news, my acceptance speech still clutched in my sweaty palm, ready to share this triumph with my family. "That's nice, honey," my mother said without looking up from Caroline's algebra homework. "Marcus, tell your father about the business internship." The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that I wondered if I'd imagined the entire election. High school brought more opportunities and deeper disappointments. I became student body president, led successful campaigns for everything from improved cafeteria food to expanded arts programs. I organized charity drives that raised thousands for local food banks. I mediated conflicts between rival groups and somehow got them working together. My family's response remained unchanged. "When are you going to focus on something practical?" My father would ask during the rare moments he acknowledged my activities. "The student government is just playing pretend. You need to think about your future." But Marcus's weekend job at a local business was celebrated like a Fortune 500 merger. Caroline's volunteer work at the hospital was treated as if she'd already saved lives. Thomas's JV football bench warming was discussed with the reverence usually reserved for Super Bowl victories. The pattern continued through college. I earned a scholarship to Georgetown full ride based on academic merit and leadership potential. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday and I held it with trembling hands, knowing this was it, the moment that would finally prove my worth. "Georgetown is expensive," my mother said, barely glancing at the letter. "Are you sure you can handle the workload? Maybe community college would be more realistic." Meanwhile, they'd already started planning Marcus's graduation party from state, where he'd earned a business degree with modest grades and significant financial assistance from my parents. At Georgetown, I found my calling. Political science, public policy, constitutional law. These weren't just subjects to me, they were languages I spoke fluently. I excelled in ways that surprised even myself, earning recognition from professors who saw something in me that my own family had missed. I called home after making Dean's List my sophomore year. "That's wonderful, dear," my mother said in that distracted tone I'd learned to recognize. "Oh, Caroline got into medical school. We're so proud. She's going to be Dr. Mitchell someday." I graduated summa cum laude, delivered the valedictorian speech, and was accepted to law school with full funding. The achievements felt hollow without recognition from the people who mattered most. The law school years were different. I stopped calling home with updates. I stopped expecting them to understand. I focused on my studies, on internships with prestigious firms, on building the foundation for something bigger than myself. It was during my final year that Professor Richardson approached me about an opportunity that would change everything. "David," he said after constitutional law class, "there's someone in Washington who wants to meet you. Someone who's been watching your work on electoral reform. Are you interested in public service?" That meeting led to another, then another. Campaign work, policy positions, staff roles that gradually climbed higher up the political ladder. Each step took me further from the family that had never understood my path, and closer to something I'd never dared to imagine. But they didn't know any of this. As far as they were concerned, I was still the disappointment who'd chosen an impractical career, the brother who'd never amounted to anything, the son who'd embarrassed them with his unrealistic ambitions. They had no idea that their failure had just spent the last 4 years living in a house they'd recognize from every American history textbook. They had no idea that tomorrow I would place my hand on a Bible and take an oath that would make me the most powerful person in the world. They had no idea that in 15 minutes, everything they thought they knew about David Mitchell would be proven catastrophically wrong. The phone call came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in November. My final year of law school. I was hunched over constitutional case studies in the library when my phone buzzed with my mother's contact. After months of minimal communication, her sudden call felt ominous. David, we need to talk. Her voice carried that particular edge I'd learned to recognize, disappointment mixed with resignation. Can you come home this weekend? I drove the 3 hours to Riverside with a knot forming in my stomach. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint slightly more faded, but my family's ability to make me feel like an intruder remained unchanged. They were waiting in the living room, arranged like a tribunal. Marcus sat in my father's old chair, his posture radiating authority, despite being only 28. Caroline perched on the edge of the sofa, her medical school acceptance letter visible on the coffee table like evidence of virtue. Thomas sprawled in the corner, fresh from football practice, still wearing his Letterman jacket at 21. My mother gestured to the lone remaining chair, positioned to face the others. "Sit down, David. We've been talking and we're concerned." The intervention that followed was surgical in its precision. Marcus led the charge, outlining my pattern of poor decisions, with the methodical efficiency he'd later bring to his real estate empire. Law school was expensive and impractical. Politics was a pipe dream for people without connections or family money. I was already 25 years old. Wasn't it time to stop playing games and join the real world? "Look at Caroline," my mother said, her voice gentle but devastating. "She'll be Dr. Mitchell in 4 years. She'll save lives. Make a real difference. What will you be?" "Another failed lawyer chasing fantasies in Washington." Caroline smiled sympathetically. "David, we care about you, but this political science thing, it's not realistic for someone like you. You don't have the background, the network, the presence for that world." Thomas, barely old enough to vote, nodded sagely.
Yeah, man.
"Why don't you come work with Marcus? Learn the business. At least real estate is stable." The worst part wasn't their words, it was their certainty. They'd discussed this without me, reached consensus about my limitations, planned this intervention with the absolute confidence that they understood my capabilities better than I did. I sat in that chair, listening to them dissect my dreams with clinical detachment, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but a crystalline moment of clarity that cut through years of self-doubt and desperate need for their approval. They would never see me. Not because they couldn't, but because they'd decided not to. I could achieve everything I'd ever dreamed of, could change the world itself, and they would still see only the awkward middle child who didn't fit their definition of success. "Are you finished?" I asked when they finally ran out of ways to explain my inadequacy. Marcus frowned. "David, we're trying to help you. The least you could do is listen." I stood up slowly, my mind clearer than it had been in years. "I have listened. For 25 years, I've listened to you tell me who I am, what I'm capable of, where I belong. I'm done listening." My mother's face softened with what she probably thought was compassion. "Honey, we just want what's best for—" "No," the word came out sharper than I'd intended. But I didn't soften it. "You want what's comfortable for you. You want me to be someone you can understand, someone who fits into your idea of what this family looks like. But I'm not that person." Caroline leaned forward, her medical school confidence on full display. "David, you're being emotional. Let's think about this rationally." "Rationally?" I almost laughed. "Rationally, I should listen to people who've never once asked me what I actually want, who's never shown the slightest interest in understanding what I'm good at, who dismisses every achievement that doesn't match their narrow definition of success." The silence that followed was different from their usual dismissals. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. Marcus recovered first, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he'd perfected in business school. "Fine. Enlighten us. What exactly are you good at that we're missing?" That's when I told them about Professor Richardson's offer. A position with the Richardson Institute, a prestigious think tank that advised congressional leaders on policy reform. Not an internship, not entry-level grunt work, but a research associate position that came with a salary, benefits, and direct access to some of the most influential people in Washington. I told them about my thesis on electoral reform, which had been recommended for publication in the Georgetown Law Journal. About the constitutional law professor who'd called my analysis brilliant and ahead of its time. About the letter of recommendation from a federal judge who'd worked with me on a summer internship. I watched their faces as I spoke, and saw the information bounce off their preconceptions like rain off glass. That's wonderful, dear," my mother said finally, but her tone suggested she was humoring a child's fantasy. "But those academic things don't always translate to real-world success. Academic things." I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its dismissiveness. "A federal judge recommendation is an academic thing." Thomas shrugged. "I mean, it's not like you're going to be president or anything." The irony of that statement would haunt me for years to come. I left that night, and never moved back home. I packed my few belongings from my childhood bedroom, loaded them into my beaten Honda Civic, and drove back to Georgetown with the strange lightness that comes from finally accepting an uncomfortable truth. My family would never be proud of me, not in any way that mattered. They would never understand my world, never celebrate my victories, never see me as anything more than their disappointing middle child who'd chosen the wrong path. But I no longer needed them to. The Richardson Institute position was everything Professor Richardson had promised, and more. Within 6 months, I was briefing senators on constitutional interpretation. Within a year, I was drafting policy papers that influenced actual legislation. Within 2 years, I'd caught the attention of people whose names appeared in history books. I sent my family a Christmas card that second year. A simple photo of the Capitol dome with a brief note. "Hope you're all well. Work is going great. Love, David." My mother called 3 days later. "David, honey, we got your card. It's nice that you're working near all those important buildings. Are you thinking about coming home for the holidays?" She'd completely missed the significance. The card wasn't a tourist photo. It was taken from the window of my office, where I was helping shape the laws that governed the country. But explaining would have been pointless. I spent Christmas alone in my Georgetown apartment, working on a brief about campaign finance reform that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. It was the best Christmas I'd had in years. That's when I knew I was truly free from their limitations. I'd built something they couldn't diminish because they couldn't understand it. I'd found my calling in a world they didn't even know existed. The years that followed were a blur of increasing responsibility and recognition: chief of staff positions, campaign management roles, advisory positions that put me in rooms with the most powerful people in the world. Each step took me further from the family that had never believed in me, and closer to something I'd never dared to imagine. But they remained oblivious. At the rare family gatherings I still attended, they'd ask vague questions about my government job, while spending hours discussing Marcus's latest property acquisition or Caroline's medical practice. I'd stopped trying to explain the significance of my work. I'd stopped needing their validation. And now, standing in this gymnasium with 12 minutes left until everything changed, I realized that their inability to see me had been the greatest gift they could have given. Their dismissal had freed me to become someone they never could have imagined, someone they were about to meet for the first time. The betrayal didn't announce itself with drama or fanfare. It arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in March, buried between policy briefings and committee reports like a landmine disguised as routine correspondence. I was serving as Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Williams at the time, a position that had taken me 8 years to earn through careful relationship building and strategic career moves. The senator trusted me with classified briefings, relied my judgment for critical votes, and had begun hinting at bigger opportunities on the horizon. The email came from my cousin Rebecca, my Aunt Linda's daughter who'd always been peripheral to the main family drama. The subject line read, "Thought you should see this." Attached was a screenshot from Caroline's Instagram account, posted the night before. The image showed my entire family gathered around a restaurant table, champagne glasses raised in celebration. The caption read, "Celebrating Marcus closing another major deal, so proud of our successful family, blessed family, first winners." But it wasn't the post itself that stopped my breath. It was the hashtag at the end. Only children that matter. Below the screenshot, Rebecca had written, "Dave, I'm sorry. I thought you should know what they're saying about you. This isn't right." I stared at the screen, reading the hashtag over and over until the words blurred. It wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was erased. They hadn't simply failed to invite me. They'd actively chosen to pretend I didn't exist. But that was only the beginning. Curiosity compelled me to dig deeper into their social media presence, something I'd avoided for years out of self-preservation. What I found was systematic, deliberate, and breathtakingly cruel. Marcus's LinkedIn profile listed him as eldest of 3 children, describing how he'd learned leadership by guiding his younger siblings toward success. Caroline's medical practice website included a family photo from 5 years ago, with me carefully cropped out of the frame. Thomas's car dealership ran radio ads where he talked about growing up in a family of achievers and learning business principles from his older brother Marcus and brilliant sister Caroline. I had been edited out of their story completely. The deeper I dug, the worse it became. My mother's Facebook was filled with proud grandmother posts about Marcus's children, celebratory messages about Caroline's medical achievements, and glowing updates about Thomas's dealership expansions. Scrolling back through years of posts, I found exactly 3 mentions of my name, each time in the context of explaining my absence from family events. David couldn't make it to Christmas this year. He's still pursuing his government hobby in Washington. Caroline graduated medical school today. I wish all our children could find such meaningful careers. Family vacation with my 3 successful children. David was invited but chose work over family again. That last one made me actually laugh out loud, a bitter sound that echoed through my empty office. I hadn't been invited to any family vacation in over a decade, but the worst discovery came from a deep dive into Caroline's professional blog, where she occasionally wrote about work-life balance for medical professionals. In a post titled, "Supporting Family Dreams vs. Enabling Delusions," she'd written an entire piece about a family member who'd chosen an unrealistic career path and how sometimes tough love means letting people face the consequences of poor decisions. She'd never used my name, but the details were unmistakable. The age difference, the government job fantasy, the inability to accept practical advice from successful siblings. To anyone who knew our family, it was clearly about me. The comments section was filled with support for her wisdom and sympathy for having to deal with such a difficult family member. Several colleagues from her hospital had chimed in with their own stories about relatives who refused to grow up and chased pipe dreams instead of building real careers. I sat in my office until nearly midnight, consuming years of casual cruelty disguised as family updates. Each post, each comment, each carefully curated image painted the same picture. The Mitchell family was successful, driven, and complete without their wayward middle child. They hadn't just rejected me, they'd constructed an entire alternative reality where I barely existed. The most devastating part wasn't the erasure itself, but the calculated nature of it. This wasn't emotional distance or benign neglect. This was deliberate, strategic, and ongoing. They'd spent years actively working to minimize my presence in their narrative, turning my absence into evidence of their superiority. I called Rebecca the next morning. "How long has this been going on?" I asked without a preamble. Her voice was heavy with sympathy. "David, I don't think you want to know. Tell me." She sighed. "It started right after you graduated law school. Your mom called it protecting the family reputation. They were worried that your career choices might reflect poorly on the others. Especially with Caroline applying to medical school and Marcus building his business network, the timeline made perfect sense now. The gradual reduction in family invitations, the increasingly rare phone calls, the shift from disappointed concern to complete indifference. It had all been orchestrated. There's more," Rebecca continued reluctantly. "Last Christmas your mom told everyone you'd become unstable after graduation. She said you'd developed unrealistic expectations about your importance and that the family had agreed to maintain distance until you came to your senses. Unstable." The word hit like a physical blow. "Rebecca, do you know what I actually do for work? Honestly?" They never really explained it. Something with politics, right? Your mom always changes the subject when anyone asks. I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of their ignorance. They'd constructed elaborate justifications for my exclusion without ever bothering to learn the basic facts about my life. They'd decided I was a failure and built their entire family identity around that assumption. I need you to do me a favor, I said finally. Don't tell them we talked, but keep watching. I have a feeling their perspective on my failure is about to change dramatically. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible even a week earlier. I was done protecting them from the truth. For years, I'd maintained careful operational security about my work, partly due to professional requirements, but mostly to avoid their mockery. I'd let them believe whatever comfortable narrative allowed them to sleep at night. But they'd crossed a line. They'd moved from private dismissal to public humiliation, from family dysfunction to character assassination. They'd weaponized my absence and turned my pursuit of meaningful work into evidence of personal failure. They'd made their choice. Now I would make mine. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I rarely used, Amanda Chen, a former classmate who now worked as a senior producer for CNN. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, and she'd always been curious about my Washington career. Amanda? It's David Mitchell. I think it's time we had that conversation about going public. The call lasted 3 hours. By the end, we'd outlined a media strategy that would change everything. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd finally realized that their opinion of me was built on willful ignorance that they'd had every opportunity to correct. Tomorrow, the whole world would know who David Mitchell really was. And my family would learn it from the same news sources as everyone else. They'd had 30 years to see me. They'd chosen blindness instead. Now they would see everything, whether they wanted to or not. The secure phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in September, 18 months after my conversation with Amanda Chen. I was already awake, reviewing briefing documents in the pre-dawn quiet of my Georgetown townhouse, when the distinctive ringtone cut through the silence. Mitchell, I answered on the first ring, knowing that calls on this particular line meant only one thing. Sir, it's Director Hayes. We need you at the compound immediately. The situation has accelerated. I was dressed and in the back of an armored sedan within 12 minutes, racing through empty Washington streets toward a location that didn't officially exist on any government map. The compound, a nondescript office building that housed some of the most sensitive operations in American intelligence, had become my second home over the past 2 years. The elevator descended far below street level, past floors that weren't marked on any building directory. When the doors opened, I was greeted by the controlled chaos of a situation room in full operation. Dozens of analysts worked at computer terminals, their screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. Wall-mounted monitors showed news broadcasts in 17 different languages. At the center of it all stood Director Sarah Hayes, a woman whose resume included time at both the CIA and FBI, before she'd been tapped to lead the most classified intelligence initiative in American history. She looked up as I approached, her expression grim. David, we've got a problem. Multiple problems, actually. For the past 3 years, I'd been living 2 completely different lives. To my family and anyone else who bothered to ask, I was still just another mid-level government employee, a policy analyst who'd somehow managed to avoid getting fired despite his impractical career choices. The truth was far more complex. In 2019, I'd been recruited for Operation Continuity, a classified program designed to identify and prepare individuals who could assume emergency leadership roles in the event of a catastrophic attack on the constitutional succession. The program had been launched in response to intelligence indicating that foreign adversaries were specifically targeting American political leadership through increasingly sophisticated means. The selection process had been grueling: psychological evaluations, security clearances that required investigators to interview people I'd known in elementary school, simulation exercises that tested everything from crisis decision-making to my ability to maintain operational security under extreme pressure. Out of nearly 3,000 initial candidates, Only 12 had been chosen for the full program. I'd spent the better part of 3 years in what was essentially a shadow presidency training program. Constitutional law with former Supreme Court clerks, military strategy with retired generals, economic policy with Nobel laureates, crisis management with former cabinet members who'd navigated real-world disasters. The training scenarios had been exhaustive and terrifying: nuclear incidents, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, biological weapons releases, coordinated strikes against government leadership. We'd worked through every conceivable nightmare, learning to make impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. But none of the training had prepared me for what Director Hayes was about to tell me. 3 hours ago, we intercepted communications indicating coordinated attacks planned for this weekend, she said, pulling up satellite imagery on the main screen. The targets include the current president, vice president, and the first 18 people in the line of succession. My blood turned to ice water. 18? Intelligence is solid. Multiple foreign actors working in coordination with domestic extremist groups. The attack is designed to create a complete leadership vacuum, throwing the country into chaos while they execute secondary objectives. I stared at the satellite feeds showing locations across Washington, each one marked with red indicators representing potential attack sites. The scale was unprecedented, not just an assassination attempt, but a systematic effort to decapitate the entire American government. Where does that leave the succession? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You're number 19 on the emergency continuity list. If this intelligence proves accurate and the attacks succeed, you'll be the highest-ranking surviving official with constitutional authority to assume executive power. The weight of those words settled over me like concrete. For 3 years, the continuity program had been theoretical, an intellectual exercise in preparing for scenarios that would hopefully never occur. Now it was 72 hours away from becoming reality. "Sir," one of the analysts called out, "we're getting confirmation from SIGINT. The communication intercepts have been verified by 3 independent sources." Director Hayes nodded grimly. "David, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about you anymore. If our intelligence is correct, you're about to become the President of the United States under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The country will be in crisis, potentially under attack, and looking to you for leadership." She led me to a private briefing room, where the full scope of the preparation became clear. For the past 72 hours, while I'd been going through the motions of my normal life, an entire apparatus had been mobilized around me. Security details had been positioned, communication networks had been established, and contingency protocols had been activated. "We've been monitoring your family's activities," Director Hayes said, consulting a thick file. "The reunion tonight presents unique security challenges." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "My family doesn't know anything about any of this." "We're aware, but if the attacks occur as scheduled, your identity as surviving constitutional authority will be public knowledge within hours. Every person who's ever had contact with you becomes a potential target or leverage point." She opened the file, revealing surveillance photos of my family at various locations around Riverside: Marcus leaving his office, Caroline at the hospital, Thomas at his dealership, my mother grocery shopping. Seeing them through the lens of national security made them seem like strangers. "We've established protective details for each family member, but they're operating undercover. Your family has no idea they're being watched." The irony was almost overwhelming. After 30 years of being invisible to them, I was about to become the most visible person in America. After decades of them dismissing my career as meaningless, I was potentially hours away from holding the most powerful office in the world. "There's something else," Director Hayes continued. "The reunion tonight, we can't cancel it without raising suspicions that might compromise our intelligence advantage. You'll need to attend as planned, maintain normal behavior, while our teams position for multiple contingencies." She handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone. "Emergency communication link. If the situation escalates, you'll receive immediate notification and extraction protocols will be activated." I stared at the device, thinking about the 17 minutes remaining until my family's world would change forever. Except now, that timeline had become far more complicated. Director, what happens if the attacks succeed? How do we maintain constitutional continuity when no one will understand how a failed government employee suddenly has presidential authority? Her smile was grim, but not without sympathy. That's where your family's situation actually becomes an advantage. You've maintained perfect operational security for 3 years. No one suspects your true role, which means the enemy hasn't targeted you specifically. But it also means you'll have to convince the American people, starting with your own family, that you're legitimate. The next 6 hours were a blur of final briefings, security protocols, and psychological preparation. I learned about the SOAR bunkers that had been prepared, the communication networks that would keep me connected to military and intelligence leadership, the procedures for addressing the nation in the event of a successful attack. But through it all, I kept thinking about my family gathered in that gymnasium, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over all of us. They'd spent 30 years convinced that I was a failure, a disappointment, someone who'd never amount to anything meaningful. In a matter of hours, they might discover that their worthless middle child was the only person standing between American democracy and complete collapse. I checked the emergency phone one more time before heading to my car. 12 minutes until the reunion, 72 hours until the potential attacks, and approximately 6 days until my identity would either remain classified forever or become the most scrutinized name in American history. My family had no idea that their biggest disappointment was about to become their country's last hope. The emergency phone vibrated against my chest at exactly 9:47 p.m., its silent pulse cutting through the gymnasium's noise like a blade. I excused myself from a conversation with my old chemistry teacher and stepped into the empty hallway, my hands steady despite knowing what the call would bring. Mitchell. Sir, it's Director Hayes. Phoenix Protocol is now active. All primary and secondary targets have been confirmed. You are now the acting president of the United States. The words should have hit me like a physical blow, but 3 years of preparation had conditioned me for this moment. My mind shifted immediately into the operational mode that had been drilled into me through countless simulations. Casualties? I asked, my voice automatically dropping to the tone I'd practiced for crisis communications. 17 confirmed dead, including POTUS and VP. The others are in various conditions, but none are capable of assuming constitutional authority. Sir, we need to extract you immediately. Through the hallway window, I could see my family still holding court at their center table, Marcus gesturing expansively while telling some story that had the others laughing. They looked so small suddenly, so utterly unaware that the world had just fundamentally changed. Negative on immediate extraction, I said, surprising myself with the decision. I need 5 more minutes. Sir, with respect, every second you remain in an unsecured location. 5 minutes, Director. I need to handle something first. I ended the call and walked back into the gymnasium, but everything had changed. The same decorations hung from the same basketball hoops, the same music played from the same speakers. But I was no longer David Mitchell, the family disappointment. I was the President of the United States, and I had a responsibility that transcended personal grievances. But first, I had something to settle. I walked directly to my family's table, my posture unconsciously shifting into the command presence that had been refined through years of leadership training. The conversation died as I approached, their faces showing various degrees of surprise and discomfort. David, my mother said with forced brightness, we were just talking about you. Weren't we, Marcus? Marcus's expression suggested they absolutely had not been talking about me. At least not favorably. Yes, we were wondering when you'd finally come over. Figured you were avoiding us. I wasn't avoiding anyone, I said calmly. I was working. Caroline laughed, that same dismissive sound I'd heard for decades. Working? David, it's Saturday night at a high school reunion. What kind of work could you possibly? The gymnasium doors opened with a sound like thunder. 6 figures in dark suits moved through the entrance with military precision, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The music didn't stop, But conversations began to fade as people noticed the newcomers. These weren't reunion attendees. Everything about them screamed federal law enforcement. They walked directly toward our table, their formation tight and professional. My family's faces shifted from confusion to alarm as it became clear that these men and women were heading straight for us. The lead agent, a woman I recognized as Special Agent Martinez from my security detail, reached our table and positioned herself at attention. The other 5 agents formed a protective semicircle, their eyes scanning the room with practiced vigilance. "Mr. President," Agent Martinez said in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent gymnasium, "we're ready for your departure, sir." The world seemed to stop. Every conversation died. Every face in the gymnasium turned toward our table. The DJ, mid-sentence in announcing the next song, simply stopped talking. 300 people stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just heard. "Mr. President." My mother's face went completely white. Marcus's mouth opened and closed without sound. Caroline dropped the plastic cup she'd been holding, its contents splashing across the table. Thomas, for the first time in his adult life, looked genuinely confused. "David?" my mother whispered, the word barely audible. I looked at each of them in turn. These people who had spent 30 years convinced they knew exactly who I was and what I was worth, who had edited me out of their family story, who had called me unstable, unrealistic, a failure. "Ma'am, sir," Agent Martinez continued, addressing my parents with professional courtesy, "we'll need you to remain calm while we secure the area. Your son's security is now a matter of national importance." The gymnasium erupted in whispers and gasps. Phones appeared as people tried to capture this impossible moment. My former classmates pressed closer, trying to understand how David Mitchell, quiet, overlooked David Mitchell, had just been addressed as the President of the United States. Marcus found his voice first, though it came out as a croak. "David, what is this? Some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke, Marcus." I looked at him directly, this brother who had spent decades treating me like an embarrassment. 3 hours ago, there was a coordinated attack on the constitutional succession. I'm now the acting president. Caroline's medical training kicked in first, her analytical mind trying to process the impossible. That's not possible. You work in policy analysis. You're not in the line of succession. I've been in the classified continuity program for 3 years. I said simply, what you thought was a meaningless government job was actually preparation for this exact scenario. Agent Martinez stepped closer. "Sir, we really need to move. The situation requires your immediate attention." I nodded, then turned back to my family one last time. They sat there like statues, their perfect little world of who was successful and who wasn't completely shattered around them. "For 30 years you told me I was worthless," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the absolute silence of the gymnasium. "You erased me from your family story. You called me unstable, unrealistic, a failure who would never amount to anything." My mother tried to speak, but no words came. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," I continued. "I'm saying it because it's important that you understand something. Your opinion of me was never based on who I actually was. It was based on who you decided I should be." Thomas, still wearing his Letterman jacket like armor against adulthood, whispered, "David, we didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You never looked. You never considered that maybe, just maybe, you didn't understand everything about the world or about me." The gymnasium had become a silent amphitheater, 300 people witnessing a moment that would be replayed on news channels for months to come. Agent Martinez touched my arm gently. "Mr. President, the helicopter is standing by." I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of the office settling around me like a mantle. In a few minutes, I would be briefed on the full scope of the crisis. I would need to address the nation, coordinate with allies, make decisions that would affect millions of lives. But first, I had one more thing to say. "I love you all," I said, and meant it despite everything. "You're my family, And that won't change. But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that the son you thought was worthless just became the most powerful person in the world. I turned to follow Agent Martinez toward the exit, then paused and looked back. And I want you to think about who else you might be underestimating. The last thing I saw before leaving the gymnasium was my family sitting in stunned silence, finally seeing me for the first time in 30 years. Outside, Marine One waited to carry the new president home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.